Hi, I'm Ann with Lighthouse Coding. Let's look at Case 2 from the Chapter 5 Practical Application. Here's a patient seen for a renal consult. The patient has been followed with CKD, and he was found to have renal failure this morning after he presented with a complaint of dehydration. The renal team is now asked to consult. Under the ROS, we see that the GU system is negative for obstructive symptoms or exposure to nephrotoxins. The PFISH, the past medical, family, and social history, is reviewed and negative for renal disease. Under the impression, we have new acute renal failure due to dehydration, underlying stage 3 CKD, and mild hypotension. Remember, we want to code the definitive diagnoses that are documented by the provider. The patient is diagnosed with acute renal failure due to dehydration, and he also has stage 3 chronic kidney disease and hypotension. First, we'll look up the acute renal failure. In the ICD-10 alphabetic index, we'll look up failure, then renal, then acute. The recommended code is N17.9. Remember, we still need to check that in the tabular list. Here we can see that N17.9 is the code for acute kidney failure. Notice that there's also a coding clinic article as well as a note that tells you that acute kidney injury is also included in this code. The documentation states that the ARF is due to dehydration, and N17.9 is the proper code for acute renal failure, but now we need to add a code for the dehydration. Let's look up dehydration in the alphabetic index. We can see that we're given the code E86.0. Again, we need to check that in the tabular to look for additional coding notes. There is an instructional note, but it's not relevant to this encounter, and there's also a reference to a coding clinic. Looking back to the impression, we see acute renal failure due to dehydration. The dehydration codes to E86.0. Number 2 under the impression states that the patient has underlying stage 3 chronic kidney disease. Looking in the alphabetic index, we see disease, kidney, chronic, stage 3, and we're given the reference code N18.30. Notice that there are also codes for stage 3A and 3B CKD. Always double check your documentation when coding for chronic kidney disease to get the correct stage coded. If the provider had documented stage 3A or 3B CKD, we would have used a different code. We then double check N18.30 in the tabular, and we can see that this is the correct code for CKD stage 3, unspecified. And the last thing that we need to code is the hypotension. This codes to I95.9, and there are no instructional notes in the tabular. So the last code, I95.9, hypotension, is added to the list. The final diagnosis coding for this visit is N17.9, E86.0, N18.30, and I95.9. That's it for Case 2. I'll see you next lesson.